Termo to Madeline, audio edition. Chapter titled George Bailey, Master Builder, page 126. George Bailey was not one of the biggest ranchers in the entire area, but he was a great builder of canals, roads, and reservoirs. It was his men who built all the huge canals on the South Fork when controlled flooding and drained the South Fork Valley, which was nothing more than a big swamp in the early years. And it was George Bailey's men and money that built some of the major waterworks and roadways on the west side of the Madeline Plains. The first project he took on at Madeline was a reservoir just above the present-day town of Madeline to the north. Bailey supplied men, horses, and scrapers for the job, as did John D. Flournoy. John Williams did the surveying and acted as overseer of the job. It was in 1883, the year Williams came to the country. He worked for wages on the project, so Flournoy and Bailey each owed a half interest in the project. In 1886, Williams bought Flournoy's interest for $250. He finally sold his interest to his daughter, May Bailey. At that time, her husband, Wilson Bailey, expanded the dam. In 1902, John Williams claimed 4,000 inches of water from the reservoir, which he assigned to May. George Bailey sold his half of the interest in the reservoir to J. Noble Jones in 1908. George Bailey's next project on the Madeline Plains was constructed of the roadbed for the NCO Railroad from Termo to Madeline. He accomplished this with mostly Indian-hired labor. It was started during the last part of June 1901 and finished in the last days of September. As soon as the project was complete, Mr. Bailey moved his crew of men and teams down to a site that John Williams had surveyed out for him south of Termo. There he built a dam approximately 6 miles from Termo to near where the town of Ravendale is today. This was done to hold back the spring runoff flowing out of the Red Rock country to be used as drinking water for the livestock during the summers. It did not do that, but more importantly, it made a roadbed for future highway builders when the U.S. Highway 395 was built through the Madeline Plains. Its contractors laid it on top of old George Bailey's dam, and that is where it remains today. Another project which George Bailey completed was the reservoir of Bailey Creek west of Termo, still known as Bailey Reservoir today. He made an irrigation system out of it to properly irrigate the swamp and overflow land on the flat. The preliminaries of the system were started in June of 1899, but the system was not completed until several years after the turn of the century. Next chapter, titled NCO Moves North, Rise of the Town of Madeline. Now, the town of Madeline arose overnight, thundering into existence at the speed of a bolt of lightning. Like Amity and Termo before it, Madeline was unheard of one day and a booming hub of activity the next. And, like Amity and Termo, the NCO Railroad was the cause of it. There was only one difference among the three towns. Madeline and Termo were destined to remain small, high desert towns, while Amity would disappear completely, except in the memories of those who were there. No one really expected the NCO to remain at Termo forever, and it had become obvious that the rails would have to go on over the Sage Hen. Now the stockmen, who were congregated into a loose-knit settlement that was already becoming known as Madeline, were not expecting the tracks to stop there. They just felt certain that a siding would be built there from which they could ship their cattle and grain and receive freight at their front doors. And not only that, but they could climb aboard a train right at their home and travel anywhere in the U.S. One of the Moran brothers and another stockholder from Wall Street came out to Termo from New York in the early days of September 1900. Elmer Van Loan personally drove them over the proposed route to Alturas in the new Baker and Hamilton buggy he had bought for his wife the previous June. They seemed impressed with the prospects of the route and advancing the line farther north. It sounded like the financing was there for the advancing the track several miles farther at least. In March of 1901, the NCO's head surveyor made a trip out across the plains north of Termo as far as the Bailey Reservoir below the Pino place. His optimism started, everyone speculating again. How soon would it be, and where would it go? He was heard to say that the railroad had built 60 miles a line the previous year and should be able to do another than that this year. He seemed to think that with 4 months of good weather the tracks would be unlikely. Well, that had the hopes of everyone on High Plain. It was not until the 1st of June, however, before any real surveying was done. The survey crew pitched some tents at the Van Loan station and began running out a couple of prospective lines. Now, both possibilities ran a couple of miles past Pino's onto Sagehand Flat. This had many people wondering if there was going to be another isolated terminus built on Sagehand. As usual, however, those who made it their business to stay on top of things knew exactly what was in the plans. George Bailey procured the contract to build 14 miles of roadbed, and his men and teams started work in the last days of June. They started clearing the route of brush at Elmer Van Loan's and progressed northwards toward the settlement of Madeline. Settlers and hired men alike did not know where the clearing of the roadbed would end, however. Elmer Van Loan knew, though. He had already completed a new butcher shop the previous October in anticipation of future business. Then on July 1st, 1901, he closed a deal, purchasing the remaining 120 acres of Barney Morton's homestead. Then he sold the NCO a right-of-way for the tracks and a freight and passenger depot about 1/8 of a mile northwest of Wilson Bailey's house. At that time, Van Loan's place was a literal beehive of activity. He had his normally large hay crew putting up hay on the ranch. Stages were going through every day on their way to Termo, Alturas, and Beaver. Wool was pouring into Termo from the north as often as many a dozen freight trains passed through Van Loan's every day. Wool was coming into Termo, and freight was leaving at such a rate that the warehouse and shipping docks were jammed. There were several large freight outfits spending the night at the Van Loan station every night, waiting to unload at Termo. The survey crews for the railroad had their camp at Van Loan's. All the Bailey's crews working on the night roadbed had their headquarters there also. At that time, Van Loan started a procedure that was to last almost continuously for 6 years. A beef a day was butchered to feed the crews, travelers and freighters. By the middle of July, the entire length of road from Termo to Madeline had been cleared of brush, and the grading crews had nearly completed grading up the 4 miles of roadbed between Van Loan's and Madeline. Men and horses had so congested the Van Loan station that one of the 2 grading crews moved up to Wilson Bailey's place to stay. Absolutely every able-bodied male on that end of the plains, from 12 years old on up, had hired out to Bailey and or the railroad, doing whatever was needed to advance the road. The graders finished up the section between Van Loan's and Madeline early in August and moved down to Brockman's and started grading up the section between there and Termo. George Bailey left the country for several weeks to buy some horses in Texas. While he was gone, John Williams had some subcontracted with him to build that portion of road between Brockman's and Van Loan's. Elmer Van Loan had gone into a partnership with Charles Spargan, son of George Wallace Sparger of Alturas. Sparger was seen often at Van Loan's, and the word was out that Van Loan and he intended to build a hotel, livery stable, and blacksmith shop at Madeline. Elmer Van Loan already had a proprietor lined up for the blacksmith shop. William Maurer had sold out to Brockman's in 1898 and moved to Yuba country because of his wife's health. She had not improved, however, and Van Loan had talked with Mr. Maurer into coming back to run the new Madeline blacksmith shop, hanging out his shingle above the main door. Madeline blacksmith and wagon maker. Dealer in all kinds of hardware. William Maurer, proprietor, Madeline, Lassen County, California. Now, a foundation in the shape of a huge 76-foot L was laid for the new Van Loan and Sparger Hotel in the beginning days of September 1901. And shortly thereafter, the Williams crew of road graders finished building the last stretch of roadbed between Brockman's and Van Loan's. Work proceeded on the hotel through October. At that time, the exterior work, with the exception of painting, was complete. But there was still much work to be done on the interior. A force of carpenters, headed up by David Meekill, J Foundation, and A.M. Miller, was working practically around the clock in constructing the hotel and a huge livery barn. Lumber was coming up to Termo on the NCO and being transferred almost daily by jerk-line teams to Madeline. During the same month of October, scrapers were busy leveling off the last bit of grade near Brockman's place. A rocky cut had to be blasted out just below Brockman's. When one of the powder charges was set off in the last week of October, a lively runaway resulted with one of the scraper teams. By the time the teamster got his animals under control, the scraper was pretty much demolished, but no one was hurt. Laying of the rails started the last week in October, too, but everything was brought to a screeching halt when no more new rails could be obtained due to a steel strike in the east. Work continued onward at the new town of Madeline, however, which now consisted of two buildings, the hotel and the livery barn. By the first week of January of 1902, when work was resumed laying still, the last coat of paint was being applied to the hotel. Now, the livery barn was complete, and work was progressing on several large livery stables. The still gang on the NCO was making up for lost time. By the middle of January, the construction train was well north of Van Loan's, and it pulled into Madeline on the afternoon of January 3rd, 1902. Service on the new line did not start until April 1st, however, to give the new roadbed time to properly settle. Activity did not slow up any at the new town of Madeline, however. The passengers' depot at Termo was jacked up and put on skids and transferred to Madeline with a 16-horse jerk line. A new freight depot was soon built across the tracks. Mr. and Mrs. Dick Russell moved up from Alturas and into the new Hotel Madeline, which they had contracted with Van Loan to operate. Mr. and Mrs. Bob Brasher, who had recently been running the eating house in Termo, also moved into the hotel. They were to help in running the hotel until it got its feet, and Bob started building the first Madeline general store in the spring. The construction train brought lumber up on the 27th of April to supply the growing need for building materials for the freight depot, livery stables and residence for the Brashers and the Hall family, who were also to help out in the running of the hotel. These two houses went up on the first two lots sold in Van Loan's newly subdivided town site of Madeline. The very first social event to take place in the new Hotel Madeline occurred on the evening of February 25th, 1902. The Russells put on a birthday feed and celebration for Charlie Sparger, who had already taken up residence in the living quarters on the north end of the enormous livery barn. A bountiful supper was enjoyed by all in the spacious dining hall, after which there was dancing and the music of Harvey Williams on the fiddle and Mrs. Brasher playing the guitar. And when there was a lull in the dancing, Dick and Lucia Russell led the entire party through the largest hotel north of Susanville for an inspection. They started in the blue wallpapered reception room, which was well lighted with gas lights. Opening off of it were 2 large bedrooms and a wide hallway. Opening off the hallway was an office, a large bar room, a washroom, and the dining hall with adjoining kitchen. The kitchen had all the modern appliances of the day, including an 8-foot 6-inch range with hot and cold ovens and a 50-gallon hot water tank. Back in the hall, a flight of stairs took the company to the upper floor, where they inspected the 20 comfortably sized bedrooms. These, too, were lighted with gas lights and a heavy oak bed with metal bedsteads. There was a flight of stairs at each end of the building, so the group took the other set back downstairs and resumed dancing until the beginning of the new day. Back outside in the growing town of Madeline, work was proceeding at a steady pace. Regular trains started running on April 1st. Now there were people besides the work crews spending the night at the hotel every night. A water tank was put up for the trains south of the hotel, and an enormous 12-foot by 12-foot well was dug. Construction of the blacksmith shop was started about the middle of April. Elmer Van Loan moved another barn up from Termo, and the NCO started work on a new engine house, which was completed about the 1st of June. The NCO was also building a new telegraph line into Alturas from its present terminus in the town of Termo. Will Smith had the contract to cut and distribute poles from Termo to Likely. Now he had cut them above Ash Valley and hauled them in with a 4-horse team. He finished distributing them in the last part of April, and the NCO line crew was right behind him putting up the line. The editor of the Alturas newspaper made a trip to the new town in early June. His words describe the bustling activity quite well. Quote, "We made a flying visit to Madeline last Friday. We found that to be quite a lively little place. There were 74 guests at the Madeline Hotel on Friday night, and we are informed that this is no uncommon occurrence. R.M. Russell and his wife are found equal to all emergencies, and their guests always leave well satisfied. They get fresh vegetables and fruit from Sacramento, and you can get a meal there that is hard to beat. Now Dick also runs a first-class bar, which does a good business. Sparger and Van Loan, who own most of the town, are doing an immense livery and feed business there, and now find their large barn incapable of accommodating the stock, and are now building 2 more good-sized barns." Unquote. So it was that Madeline, the second town on the Madeline Plains, was off to a roaring start, and, unlike Termo, it was to continue booming for the next good many years. Next chapter, titled John Smith's Local Freight Line, page 135.